program, Father Dr. Joseph Lobo, the coordinator of our research program and research committee at St. Joseph's College. Father Principal, express our gratitude to him for making these arrangements possible, to Richard and others on the staff who have worked on all this. Thank you very much and a warm welcome to all of you. And a very warm welcome to Dr. Sindhu. Dr. Sindhu J is professor, associate professor of English at the Bangalore University, Jnana Bharati, Department of English. She has been an active research scholar as well. I know this firsthand because I have had the privilege of being her research guide. As it turned out, she was an outstanding researcher, and our sessions of mutual consultation were very, very beneficial. I hope it worked both ways, and I'm really happy that she's with us this morning to share with us her own insights into the whole process of research in literature and literary studies. Now, the the thing about research is that it begins with curiosity, and it ought to be a joyful process. And there are 100 and 1,000 different ways of doing research. Now, what is the big difference between research in our field, that is literature and language, and between that and the sciences? You see, the sciences, you have the labs. So, for example, if someone wants to know which metal would be ideal as a material for being more efficient in battery for use in battery, you test out the metal in the lab, record all your observations, test out others, compare and contrast, build a tabular column based on all the experimental results you get, and then finally you publish a paper. So your work is in the laboratory. On the other hand, if you are in the social sciences field, you want to do a field survey, you go out into the field to find out how many are below the poverty line in a particular village before and after, say, a particular program was implemented. So, such surveys can last for a year or maybe a decade and so on and so forth. These can be ongoing studies. But what about literary studies? In the literary studies, our lab and our field are basically books and texts, including film texts, which we work with. This is not to say that other methods such as survey, readership surveys, and so on are ruled out. They are also possible. But our primary work is largely with books and in the library, because what we are examining is the way something has gotten articulated in a particular culture, artistic forms, either in our case, literature, but it can also be performing arts, drama, and allied arts. It can also be interdisciplinary research in which, literary studies can be pursued through contexts that include other fields, such as maybe environmental science, ecology, or philosophy, and so on. So there are numerous possibilities. And so this morning, without further ado, I will turn you over to Dr. Sindhu. And over to Sindhu. Please take us wherever you want to, using your own insight and your own rich experience. Yeah. So over to Dr. Sindhu this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cherian sir, for this generous introduction. I would like to thank the organizers of this lecture session today, Dr. Father Lobo and Dr. Arul Mani, who initially contacted me and asked me if I would be willing to be a part of this session. There's just one small thing that I would like to add to what Dr. Alexander was saying. It was my privilege and honor to have been his first PhD student. I don't know why he said it should be the other way around, but I think I learned a lot from having had him as my PhD guide, mainly because he let me be. He never once imposed his views on me. And every discussion that we had was, I think, so very beneficial to me in so many ways. And I keep thinking of all that he said to me back then, even now, because it has helped me. And more of this a little while from now. It's, I think, the first time that I'm actually lecturing to a largely unknown audience. Uh, in the last 6 months, I have been taking online classes for my own students, and many of them are not from economically sound backgrounds, and so they have had a lot of problems accessing online classes. And to address this problem, I was trying to record my classes and send it to them on WhatsApp and so on. Uh, Despite having had to use the online methods of teaching for the last 6 months, I'm still somewhat uneasy with talking to a screen. I so much prefer standing in front of a room full of people and knowing that it's a much more human transaction. Anyway, things being what they are, I suppose uh, we should be happy that we have these alternative modes of communication. What I planned on doing today is to speak for about 35 or 40 minutes and keep plenty of time for interaction, because I'm much more interested in the interactive part of this lecture than mere lecturing on my part. Um, I would like to just touch upon the larger scenario in which academics and research are happening in our country today. I'm just going to touch on it because I feel that it's a rather bleak scenario and there isn't very much that we can do about it. But there are factors in this scenario that we need to take into account if we are going to uh, engage in research seriously. And so I will speak of it. The first and biggest problem that I see coming our way in future months and years is the national education policy. We've all, I think, attended any number of seminars and webinars on the NEP already. And I think it's testimony to the impact of governmentality on academics and research. I do not know how it is going to translate into our experience as teachers and as students, but it's coming all right, you know. And the other, even more disturbing trend that we've been up against in recent times is one of UGC's infamous declarations that they are going to shortly give us suitable topics for research. Both these have disturbed me greatly because it seems to me that somebody else deciding for you what you should be doing research on, for me, it goes against the very idea of research itself. Because I can't help feeling that one needs the greatest kind of freedom and breathing space when it comes to thinking and research. You know, somebody else telling us from a position of authority what we ought to be thinking, how we ought to be thinking, and what we ought to be writing and putting down as part of human knowledge is to me very disturbing. And this is just something I want to place on record. I don't know what we can do about it. Uh, we have to wait till we come to that bridge before we actually cross it. The autonomy of universities, especially state universities, I feel has been severely hampered by factors which are largely beyond our immediate control. You know, there is majoritarian right-wing politics, and then there's a steady corporatization that's happening in all universities. Those of us who have joined the teaching profession in the last, say, 10 or 15 years will have been impacted by the trends that have formed the texture of this corporatization. Uh, there is a certain emphasis on performance, which young teachers would have immediately experienced. And then there is also an emphasis on the documentation of this performance. You know, what you did and how much you did somehow becomes a lot more important than what you did and why you did it. You know, so there's a certain quantifying trend over quality, and that to me, again, is very disturbing because it seems to me that we are merely imitating outward forms of Western academics without really learning anything that is learnable from them. You know, so I don't want to spend too much time on this larger scenario, as I said, because it's pretty depressing and there's not very much we can do about it. In fact, our position is roughly similar to the frog that Simone Weil describes when she spoke of King Priam in the Iliad going to the Achaean camp and asking for his dead son Hector's body back from the enemy camp. Simone Weil has this absolutely immortal critical work on Homer's Iliad called uh, The Iliad, a Poem of Force, in which she argues that force is really the hero of the Iliad and not any of the heroes that are described there. And she says that what Priam had to do after his son's death was really like the knee jerk reaction of a frog that has been captured, and its helplessness is what is documented there. And I can't help drawing a parallel between teachers in state institutions today vis-a-vis governmentality in the form of either the UGC or uh, the HRDC. Anyway, I shall now move on to something less depressing and go on to local specifics, which concern all of us today. I think for those of us who wish to engage in research, the foremost thing would be to read. If reading is not a part of your life, and by reading I mean reading around, reading for pleasure, reading because it interests you and it helps you to fulfill a certain need, a psychological or emotional need. I think reading is very important. Um, so that I think would be the very first step in formulating a topic.
Sindhu, can I interrupt briefly?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, sorry. I just to make sure, please, others, don't unmute yourself while Dr. Sindhu is talking. Just put your system on mute and also also mute your video, because it looks like the system is not able to take so much load from time to time. Sindhu's voice is breaking up. Audio. Yeah.
Shall I continue? So it's stuck actually.
Continue, Sunil.
Should I continue? Am I audible?
Yes,
ma'am, you are audible.
Ma'am, I think you're audible. I think Sir's screen is getting stuck.
Okay.
Ma'am, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Right. So, as I was saying, I think formulating a topic is the biggest challenge in front of a young researcher today, a would-be researcher. And having been a guide for the last 6 years now, I have learned a number of things that I would never have known as a student. And apropos of this experience, I would like to say that it's a good idea not to regard the guide as a topic dispenser. You know, I've had students coming to me in a spirit of complete submission and telling me that they are ready to work on anything that I would suggest to them. Now, while this does look like an admirable open-mindedness, believe me, it isn't, because you're simply putting the entire burden of finding a topic on the guide without doing any work yourself, you know. So I feel that such an attitude is not helpful to the would-be researcher. I think it would be a much better idea to read around and go with a few ideas to whoever is destined to be your guide or willing to be your guide, and discuss it with that person rather than simply leave the whole thing to them. The second step that I feel is important in formulating a topic would be to be able to clearly distinguish between the subject field and the topic itself. A lot of students have come to me and said, we are working in gender studies, they say, for example. Now, gender studies is an entire subject field. It's an entire discipline in itself, if you like. And you can't possibly be doing research on the entire field. There has to be a topic. And so if, for example, gender identity were being worked on, that would be a topic within the field. So this basic step of being able to distinguish between the subject field and the topic, I feel, is crucial in the initial stages of research. The third point that I would like to make is identifying a research gap. This again takes a lot of reading before one is able to identify an area in which more work can possibly be done. One of the first problems that arises when someone sets out to do research is that everything looks like it's already been taken, as they say. You know, there doesn't seem to be any area of human knowledge where there isn't already a lot of work done. And so finding fresh ground for research is not easy. It is something that requires a lot of reading and a lot of thinking, about that reading before it can happen. I would like to take my own example here because I haven't yet had any students who have submitted their theses for me to be able to use them as an example. When I was trying to come up with a topic for my PhD program, it was not that I was particularly interested in travel writing, but more of this later. I will tell you how I came upon this topic a little later. But one of the books that was very useful to me in my research was the Cambridge Companion to Travel Writing, published by Cambridge University Press in 2002. I think there have been 2 other editions now. I think 2013 is the latest edition. Uh, I noticed in this volume that every part of the world has been talked about except Central Asia. Now, Central Asia happens to be the focus of my PhD research. I was trying to analyze the images of this part of the world through travel writing. And so I was pretty thrilled because I realized, after I'd written my thesis, that this part of the world had simply not been talked about in such a seminal critical work on travel writing. I even remember writing to the editor of this volume. His name is Peter Hume. And I pointed out that this part of the world had not been discussed at all. And he acknowledged it. He said that perhaps in future editions, this gap might be addressed. Till now, even in the 2013 edition, I see nothing on Central Asia there. So it remains unacknowledged. I also feel that those of you who are able to access an MPhil program would hugely benefit by it because it's something like a stepping stone to a PhD program. It's much smaller in scope and it, I think, helps people to get into research mode. I did an MPhil myself in the years when Bangalore University was still offering an MPhil program. We no longer offer it. The program ran into a lot of disrepute and was wound up for various reasons. But I can't help feeling that between an MA and a teaching job and PhD, there is a huge distance, and an MPhil program, I feel, is very beneficial because it helps you to get into different kinds of research. And very often, the topic that you finally zero in on for your MPhil might well tempt you to explore further, in a PhD program, which is clearly what happened to me as well. I'll talk about it soon. For those of you who can't, for whatever reason, access an MPhil program, writing book reviews and attending seminars and writing papers for these seminars, essays, I think is one good way of starting to do your own thinking and writing. A seminar paper is usually about between 6 or 10 pages in length, and it's not too frightening. At least I found it very useful. I remember going to seminars long before I went to attend an MPhil coursework program, and it really does help to be part of seminars and listen to the kind of arguments and discussions that go on there. At this point, I would like to make a slight digression and talk about the NET, National Eligibility Test, that most young teachers are required to clear nowadays if they want a permanent job, especially in a government institution. The NET I have found is mostly based on a kind of colonial hang-up because they really just expect you to know your British literature thoroughly well, and if you know it, you can clear the exam in no time. But I can't help feeling that learning things by rote and dredging things up from memory and writing them in a multiple choice questionnaire is not really a reflector of how good a teacher one is going to be ultimately. In fact, the one doesn't have anything to do with the other, I feel. I've had candidates for PhD who have cleared their NET, and one is led to think that a certain quality can be expected. And I have often found that they are as dismal as anybody else. I mean, it doesn't really help. It's not always a reflector of quality. This is just a point that I wanted to make. I will now move on to the kinds of problems and challenges that people who wish to do research today might be up against, and which I too have been up against in recent times. I think the first problem is there is far too much information. Just because information is available does not make it knowledge. A lot of young people mistake information for knowledge. It's a problem of plenty, actually. Easy availability of material. I remember going to seminars where students were largely the participants, and I used to wonder at the ease with which they reeled off all kinds of complex terms and concepts and really sophisticated vocabulary. And I was so naive. I didn't realize that these children were simply copying and pasting from the net, stuff that they had downloaded. Um, and nobody seemed to have any issues with plagiarism. Plagiarism is the next big point that is associated with research. It is something that those of you who wish to do serious research will have to take into account, because in this country we are really creative when it comes to plagiarism. We have all kinds of plagiarism. Plagiarism which the MLA handbook has not heard of, actually. There are ghost writers, people who are willing to produce a thesis in a twinkling for a consideration. And then there is what the UGC defines as self-plagiarism, where you have a published paper from some seminar or conference, and then you add a little bit to it from the net, and it becomes a chapter, and then you reproduce it as part of a thesis. So all sorts of plagiarism is happening, and it's something that you need to keep in mind if you're planning on undertaking research. Documentation, once again, which is related to plagiarism, has become extremely complicated and easy too at the same time, because technology has enabled us to document things easily. But then, because of online sources and the variety of online sources that we have today, documentation has also become very, very complex. I was recently grappling with the MLA 8th edition for something that I had to document, and I found that I couldn't make head nor tail of it. And in utter despair, I went back to the 7th edition, which is far more accessible. So for those of you who are planning on, doing a PhD, I would actually recommend that you look at the 7th edition, which is much more accessible, before going on to the 8th. I think also making a working bibliography is something that helped me a very great deal when I was looking for a suitable topic for research. Making a reading list for yourself, making a working bibliography is very useful. When students come and ask me which is a good book to read or which is a useful book to read, I tell them all books are useful, provided one reads them. I don't think there is such a thing as one useful book or the most useful book. I think all books are useful. It depends on what one's purpose is and why one is undertaking it in the first place. So a working bibliography helps in two ways. One, it helps you to keep track of the sources that you have been accessing and reading. It also helps you to access these documentation details later on if you do decide to use those works in your research. I would like to give a rather amusing example here of what happens if you do not make a working bibliography. Even though the joke is at my own expense, I would like to share it with you. When I was doing my MPhil, the topic that I was dealing with was a Central Asian oral epic by name Manas, which had appeared in English translation in the year 1995. And I was working on the location of this oral epic in the Central Asian oral epic tradition for my MPhil work. And I had come across in the course of my reading a very catchy kind of a, it was some sort of a epithet, I suppose, a recurring epithet, something like a Homeric epithet. The epithet ran as follows. It said, "Who will weep over your headless body?" This was a question that is asked as a kind of refrain when it comes to singing an elegy for the fallen hero of the epic. Now, at that time, I was younger and foolish. Now I'm just old and foolish. That's another issue. Anyway, I didn't note down where exactly I got this, catchy phrase from. And I so badly wanted to use it as the title of a chapter in my MPhil dissertation, but then I couldn't because I just could not find the documentation details for this phrase. And to this day, I haven't found it. I don't know where it disappeared. I just couldn't find it again. So this is just an example to show you how sometimes keeping track of what one is reading through a working bibliography can be very useful. Another point that I would like to make is about cultivating an objective style in writing. I know that research can be, in literature, can be very personal, can be very subjective, and therefore it is all the more challenging to be able to say what you think while also keeping a certain academic objectivity in mind. I think a certain tentativeness to the argument is also important. Here again, I would like to take an example from my PhD research. I remember going to submit a half-yearly report to Dr. Alexander, and sometime later after he'd read it, he told me, "You might want to think of alternatives to the word very in your writing," he said. He said in his own gentle way, "How about to a large extent or by and large?" These are alternative phrases that you could use. Why do you use the word very quite so often? And having said something defensive, I came away. And when I looked at this half-yearly report, I was dismayed to find that I had used the word very not less than a dozen times in the course of a single page. He was right. I had been so anxious to make a point that I hadn't stopped to look how the writing was coming out and how the writing reflected my vehemence in writing. So this is just something to keep in mind. Keeping paraphrased material distinct from one's own writing, again, is very important in research. I have noticed in recent times that a lot of PhD theses begin with a quotation. You open the thesis, it says introduction, and then you find the quotation hanging in the air, as it were. It's from somebody or the other, it doesn't matter who, but there's a quotation there, and one just doesn't know what that quotation is doing there, but it's there. I don't know where this practice came from and why people think that it somehow lends a certain air to the proceedings, but I don't think it's a good idea. Personally, I'm against using quotations which are simply hanging in the air without any reference to what one might be writing about. I would also like to comment on the activities of browsing and surfing. The kind of browsing and surfing that I did 15 years ago was mostly physical. I actually went to dusty bookshelves, picked out books that nobody had disturbed for years, actually held them in my hands and looked at them. Today's browsing and surfing are, of course, largely digital processes. Again, I have never been very comfortable with online surfing though I do it when it is required of me. For me, the onslaught of advertisements urging you, to do bulk downloading, I somehow find it very distracting. I don't like it when somebody somewhere is observing your browsing and then tells you what they think you might like to read next. These things bother me. Like I said, Xeroxing, Googling, and downloading cannot be research. They can only be the means to an end. They cannot be the end in itself. If one looks at research as a voyage of discovery, then I think Googling and downloading can help you only that much. At some point, your investment will have to come into it as well. Compiling is again another problem that I have come up against in research programs. Compiling information cannot be research, once again. It can only be to support one's argument. I don't think information should be forwarded in place of an argument. This is something that I just want to emphasize. Theoretical framing for the information that you find relevant to your topic is very important. Here again, I would like to share with you an example that comes from my own experience of doing a PhD. I remember in my PhD Viva, the external examiner asked me why I had not used post-colonial theory more than I had for my research. Since the subject field was travel writing, his question was not unreasonable. Travel writing, as we know, is inextricably linked with the history of colonialism and the imperial age. But I had an answer to his question, which is that the forms of colonial domination that happened in Central Asian history are different from how we normally understand these processes as part of Western history. There was no Western power that actually came and colonized any country in Central Asia. You only have Russia trying to take over Afghanistan, and that too unsuccessfully. You have the Russian Empire, both during Tsarist times as well as in Soviet times, trying to add this vast geographical area to its own domain and calling it part of the Russian Empire. But the colonialism was very different. The appropriation that happened there cannot really be called colonialism at all. And so I told the examiner that post-colonial theory was not really going to be very appropriate for me. It was not really going to help me very much in my analysis. What I did do instead, in place of this theoretical framework, was to try and formulate my own framework, which had to do with identifying historical junctures in the history of travel writing in Central Asia. I was trying to do two things in this thesis. One was to try and identify the different images that Central Asia was associated with through travel writing, over centuries. The other was to trace the evolution of travel writing itself as a genre in relation to Central Asia. So these were the two things that I was trying to do. And so I found that focusing on important historical junctures in Central Asian history was very useful. It was a way of dividing the material that I wanted to write into chapters. There was, of course, the phase of Tsarist expansion, And then there was what is known as the Great Game, which is a rather catchy term that is used to signify the the power battle that happened between the Russians and the British over domination in Central Asia. And of course, you also have the Soviet, post-Soviet phases.
Can can I can I intervene, Sindhu?
Yes, please do.
Sindhu, I think you have another 2 minutes before we get to the discussion part.
Right, right. I'll wind up. I'll be done in a second. Yeah. Okay, there's just another 2 minutes, so let me quickly say one last point that I wanted to make. The term literature itself, in the post-1960s phase, I feel has enlarged so much that it doesn't necessarily mean a work of literature anymore. There are so many different uh, sources, that there are so many possibilities and freedoms that we can use when it comes to cultural studies. And so I was just thinking that it might be useful to list out a few areas in which research is currently being done today. I think in this pandemic phase, there has been a lot of emphasis on crisis studies and on conflict studies, on migrant literature, um, disability studies, also very interesting area, on eco-criticism as well, apocalypse narratives also. So there are so many different areas, which if you have the chance, one might want to take up. There's film and media studies, there's Dalit studies, subaltern studies, performance studies. And when I say performance, I don't mean just dance, drama, music. I mean, there's so many other things that one might want to look at: folklore studies, etc., children's literature, and so on. Um, Doing a literature review is, I think, very important. Once again, one should never assume that one is the first to be speaking on a given topic. I think one should start with the assumption that others have said things on this topic before we came to it. And so the thesis statement that one might want to formulate would necessarily be dependent on doing a literature review. I recently read a book that I found very interesting. This is just to give you an example of possibilities, in folklore studies. This was a book by Wendy Doniger, the lady who became famous for having her book banned. But this is another book that she wrote. This is called The Ring of Truths and Other Myths of Sex and Jewelry. I found it extremely interesting. This is just to give you an example of how minute, after all, a ring is such a tiny little thing. And here is a scholar who has actually traced how this motif has functioned in myth and folklore across cultures and written an entire thesis on it. Maybe I should stop now. There's a lot more I wanted to say, but I want to keep room for discussion. So I think I'll stop here for now.
Dr. Sindhu, thank you very, very much for that very enlightening presentation. You spoke with conviction and you spoke from your experience of research. Thank you for keeping it personal also. Those anecdotes were very helpful. And I'm sure there are lots of things that people can take away with them from this. Also, there have been some questions. There's been one question posted on the chat for Dr. Sindhu.
Yeah.
It says, "Sir, I'm lecturer from Christo Jayanti College, and she would like a little elaboration on publication in Scopus or UGC UGC career journals, maybe." UGC
Yeah,
journals for literature. You see, this is one concern, Sindhu, that lots of people
yeah,
have definitely, because in back in our days, it's
yes,
published in a reasonably good journal, which was peer reviewed.
yes.
Uh, that was good enough. But now, every year, you have some journal or other being pulled out
Oh,
of the
yes.
list. Yeah. So there's a lot of anxiety among scholars about it. So what are your thoughts on that?
I share this anxiety uh, wholeheartedly because uh, the UGC is actually playing with our lives when it comes to performance and documenting our performance because the UGC care list is very, very controversial. And I think just 2 days ago, I came across a news item that said that they have actually gone back on this decision now, and peer reviewed journals are actually going to be considered on par with the list of approved journals in the UGC care list, which actually came into effect from 14th June 2019. The only difference is in the number of points that one would earn for publication in these journals. I think peer-reviewed journals will now fetch 10 points per publication. And if it is a publication in a care list journal, then it earns 25 points. I speak as one who is up against this problem myself. But then again, I think the individual teacher should not be held accountable for the quality of the overall quality of a journal. I remember publishing in an international journal, and they did not give me the points that I should have been given simply because the word international did not appear anywhere in the title of the journal. And with people doing the scrutiny of my
That that
application,
that
you
is
know,
how idiotic bureaucracy can be.
exactly, I mean, they said, show me the word. Where is the word international in the title? If it's not mentioned, if the word peer reviewed is not mentioned,
Yeah.
then we can't, possibly give you the points. So this is a ongoing problem actually, but I think the UJC has been forced to admit that peer-reviewed journals in this country ought to be given some credence. I can actually share that news clip with Dr. Alexander on WhatsApp a little later, and
Sure,
everybody could access it.
sure. It doesn't look like there are any other questions at the moment, so I will, kind of throw a bit of a reflection your way, and I'd like to bounce it off you and see how
Yes,
what you feel about it, which is, you know,
yes.
this whole idea of research. You began with this whole thing about reading
Mm,
and the need to have a reading life of one's own.
mm,
That it is impossible to do research if one is not a passionate and voracious reader. To be a researcher, one has to have that as the primary prerequisite. Reading for oneself, reading for pleasure, reading for joy
mm,
should be the basic thing. And then after that, a set of disciplines like documenting, the source of a book matters, which year it was published matters, where it was published from matters, the ability to, or the skill in making connections between works of literature, which came earlier, which came later, so therefore which could have influenced which one. This
mm,
historical sense of history.
mm.
All of these things are important, I would think. As you look at researchers coming your way now, do you see that these things are given the importance they deserve?
I'm afraid I have a very pessimistic answer to make to this query. It is an increasing problem, because the idea of reading is itself dying, I think, amongst those who come for research today. I don't know whether my experience has been particularly bad or whether it is a part of a larger trend. But I think young people are very impatient with the idea of sitting down with a book nowadays. I mean, when I was younger, and even now, age has nothing to do with it actually. I think curling up with an interesting book has got to be one of my idea of a good time anyway. And either one has the reading habit or one does not.
Yes.
I think it's as simple as that. Finally, books either exist for you or they don't. And I think reading as a habit is something that is, I feel it takes precedence over research actually, because you can be a voracious reader and you can think about things. You don't necessarily have to do research, I mean, but
Yeah.
then I would
It,
say
it, it
that
won't it won't work. It won't work the other way. That is that you want to do research for the sake of getting points,
oh yeah,
but you're not a reader, so you want to tweak and manipulate. That
oh
won't work.
yes,
Yeah.
oh yes, oh yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Those are by and large the kind of research students that one is dealing with nowadays. They want the degree in a great hurry, especially
Yes.
since it has become a basic degree nowadays.
Yes.
And I think also because the UGC is still keeping that option open that you can either qualify the NET exam or have a PhD in order to obtain a permanent
Okay.
job. And so
So
as
so
long as
so one need not be in a mad rush.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's another question, Sindhu here. Ma'am, I think that people are merely selecting some theories to work on certain novels or poems or drama, but this is of no use to the world, I think. So how can we solve this problem? This whole question then of, starting with some theoretical framework and then looking around for a text which will fit that framework seems to me to be the wrong way of going about it. Start
Hmm.
with your passion and then look around for what theory suits you,
True.
and be very, choosy about theories. Dump a theory if it doesn't help you,
True.
and make your own theory along the way if you feel that helps you. But this whole being imprisoned by the need to be chained to a theory or theoretical
Oh,
framework
yes.
is a problem, don't you think?
I think it's a problem. In fact, I think theory scares people off,
Yeah,
actually, the very
yeah,
idea of research.
yeah.
So, yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think it's
But
a
even as you are researching, you are also theorizing, aren't you? Well, why
true,
the hell
very
should you lean
true,
on somebody else's frame? You
very
can
true,
have the courage to build your own theory as you go along if the existing ones don't help you.
true.
Don't
That's
you think
very
that's
true.
the case? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Um, I think we are close to the end of this program. It's going to be 1 o'clock, and I think we should wind up because that's all the time we have for today.
Right.
Sindhu, I just uh, can't express in words what a joy it is to make your acquaintance once again in this format. And I'm sure lots of our friends who know you well here are here, and we are really happy that we had this opportunity to interact with you. So thank you very much for sparing your time and being with us this morning.
I'm very happy to have been a part of this session myself. I consider it a privilege to have been invited to be a part of any academic activity that happens in St. Joseph's. Thank you so much, sir. You are always extremely kind to me.
Thank you. Now, I also want to take this opportunity to thank our office staff who have helped. Want to thank Dr. Lobo, who is head of research at St. Joseph's, Father Principal also for the encouragement he's been giving. I want to thank Dr. Arulmani, head of Department of English, for doing a lot of groundwork to get this organized. The heads of departments of Kannada, Hindi, and so on from the various institutions under the St. Joseph's banner, St. Joseph's College, St. Joseph's College of Commerce, St. Joseph Autonomous, St. Joseph's College, Evening College. These are the St. Joseph's institutions. So grateful to all of them for all the work that you put in to get this off the ground and to organize this. And for all the participants who came, thank you very much. It's time now for me to hand this over for a few announcements to Father Dr. Lobo. Over to Father.
First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Cherian, for anchoring and chairing this session so effectively. Thank you very much for your generous help. Thank you, Dr. Sindhu, for that wonderful exposition. on this topic. I'm very grateful to you, and all of us are very grateful to you for obliging us. I have an important announcement to make for all our viewers. Namely, this is part of our webinar series. We had begun in the month of August a webinar on intellectual property rights, and it went on so well. And then on the 7th of this month, we had one on social sciences, research methods in social sciences, and today on literary studies, and then another 3 or 4 to come. One will be on the 17th on physical sciences, research methodology in physical sciences. Then one we will have in media sciences, and thereafter on the 21st, that would be, and thereafter one on life sciences. I shall certainly send you the information in due course of time, and I hope all of you and many more may visit this, attend these seminars and be benefited by this. I thank you very much, all the participants, and wish you all the very best. Thank you.